Interview is being done for a video history of Columbia County, which is under the auspices and supported by the Dayton Historical Depot Society. Today is June 9th, 1991. Dean Smith is interviewing Jim Thompson at the depot. Mike Floyd is doing the filming.
Today we have Jim Thompson with us, and Jim is visiting in Dayton, and we're going to take advantage of that fact, Jim, and get some of the Thompson history from you. As sort of a start here, would you tell us where you live now and why you're living there?
Well, I live in Green Valley, Arizona, and prior to that I lived 18 years in Southern California. So I'm a refugee from Los Angeles. And we settled in Green Valley because some friends of ours that had a gift shop and came to the market in Los Angeles had a gift shop in Green Valley, and they invited us over for a Labor Day vacation weekend. And we went over there for the weekend and came home with a vacation townhouse. Because Green Valley, I'll give the Chamber of Commerce pitch now, it is a delightful spot that lives up to its name of a green valley in the desert. And it's surrounded by the Santa Rita Mountains on one side. You look out and see Mount Hopkins where the Lone Telescope is, and all kinds of beautiful things. And it's close to Tucson, which is a city of almost 500,000 people, and has a large university and all kinds of cultural activities that are near at hand.
How far are you from the Mexican border?
We're about 40 miles from the Mexican border, right down Interstate 19. Green Valley is a schizophrenic community, in that there's some people who would like to make it a retirement community like Sun City, and some of the rest of us feel that it's much better like it is as a general community. We have school systems, and we have young people and children, and that is kind of nice compared to some of the other places.
What keeps you busy there, Jim? Yeah, are you interested in community activities, that type of thing?
Oh, to some extent. I'm president of the Friends of the Library, and we just completed $1.5 million remodeling of our library. It's one of the finest branch libraries in the country. And the Friends have spent about $60,000 on improvements to beyond what the bond issue would. We buy large print books, we support a children's literacy program, and things like that. I'm also the moderator of the Good Shepherd United Church of Christ, which we tried to start, or are starting. We started last year, and we are a new church start. We have about 40 members, and about 60 to 80 that come to services. And we presently meet in a defunct savings and loan building, courtesy of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, I guess that's what it's called, on a 30-day notice that we must vacate. So we do that. And I try to avoid all the other. Green Valley has 1,000 different kinds of political units and volunteer organizations and this and that. And having spent 30 years in the school system where people fight about things all the time, I don't get involved much with that.
Well, I agree with you, Jim. It's a delightful place, and we enjoyed visiting with you there and enjoyed that community a great deal. Let's move back to where you are today, Dayton. You grew up here, and where did you live, Jim?
Well, I was born and lived until I was 18 years old at 410 East Pettit Avenue. And I should let a secret out that probably nobody knows. My name really is Franklin James Thompson IV. Nobody ever did Jimmy in school. And I was Jimmy with an IE because in my class in Dayton grade school there were 4 Jameses. And there was Jim Weber, and Jimmy with a Y Snyder, and Jimmy with an IE Thompson, and I can't remember who the James was. But anyway, no, my parents were married in 1914, and in 1916 they built a house out on the Pataw near Chard. Matter of fact, they built their house on the old Chard homestead. And I had a sister who was born in 1918 and died in 1921 while they were still living out there. And my mother never went back. So when I was due, my grandfather built that little house on Panet Avenue, right up the block from them on the side of the street. And that's where we lived because Mother never would go back out to the ranch. I don't blame her. It's 22 miles from Dayton, up a 2-mile dirt road that even now I hesitate to take my car. And the way they used to come to town though was over the down into the Toucan and out that way, and down that grade on the what do they call it? It's well, I can't remember what it is. It's a state highway.
Is that the blind grade?
Yeah, that's it. That's it. And it is too, if you've ever gone over it.
Yes. Jim, one thing I remember about your ranch, I think it's the first place that I saw a tractor pulling farm equipment rather than horses and mules pulling the equipment. Isn't that true?
I think that's probably true because before, well, my parents were married in 1914, and my father was farming my grandfather's properties, which were almost all up the North Touchie and on to Cahill Mountain. He had about 5,800 acres of one kind or another. And they lived, when they were first married, my parents, out about 7 miles from town in a little house that's been torn down now. And that's hilly out in the north.
Yes, it is.
And my father was enchanted with mechanical things. He really wanted to be an engineer, and his father was a fairly dominating man, and his role in life was to manage my grandfather's properties. Younger brother was to be a dentist or a doctor, and the older brother was to be a businessman. And that's the way it was. But in 1916, or around in there, a lot of Columbia County people, or quite a number of them, not a lot, I guess. The only one I really know were the Pettyjohns, went over into Montana, where Montana was being homesteaded and opened up as and one of the advantages of Montana was that it was level and they could use mechanical equipment. So Dad was all fired up to go over to Montana. And my grandfather was bound and determined that he wasn't. The solution was that they found possibly the only ranch in Columbia and Garfield County that was relatively level, up on the high plateau between the Pataw and the Toucan. Most of it's in Garfield County, and a little piece of it is in Columbia County. So Granddad bought that property, which was part of the old Chard estate, and also built a house and barns and all of the stuff, and bought a whole 75 tractor, which is the one that you saw.
Now, what year was this?
That was in 1916. And he used that whole tractor out there until 1936, where he was traded it in for, he didn't trade it in, he stored it, and in World War II turned it into the scrap, which is a tragedy. But it was an old 2-cylinder Holt with a 6-foot flywheel. And the cylinders were about 3 feet across, 2 of them. And they fired about 2 seconds apart. And the flywheel revolved, and it had, over the heavy part of the tractor, there were tracks, crawler type, but it steered with 2 little wheels out in front. You know, and it was a cumbersome thing, and I doubt if it ever could go more than a couple miles an hour. But it was mechanical. And he also was probably one of the first farmers to shift over into bulk handling of wheat. And the first, eventually, he built an elevator out there, which burned in the early 70s, I guess. Used to be able to see it coming down the Dodge grade way up on the hill. But the first grain storage were big metal tanks that were up in the middle of the field. There are 1,100 acres out there, and it's about evenly divided into 2 fields. And he had these big storage tanks. When I was a boy growing up, they had a little gas elevator to fill bins. And I always got to do the things that none of the hired men ever wanted to do, you know, cleaning out the bins when they got wet and the wheat stunk and
the rats and mice.
The rats and mice and flying ants were around there. Well, I'd be down in there shoveling. And that's probably one reason why I decided not to be a farmer. But anyway, he also farmed, but with horses, farmed because that tractor couldn't be moved back and forth. He also farmed, Granddad had about 1,000 acres of farmland on the 2-sheet up Hadley Gulch. Well, it's on both sides of the road from the river up clear to the top into Cahill Mountain. And then he had about another 500 acres up on Cahill Mountain that abutted that. And then there was about 2,800 or so acres of timber. And that was all second growth timber up there. And there was a huge pile of sawdust that came from the sawmill that was up there when they built Central School, and all of the timber that was used in the old Central School came from up there.
Now, did your grandfather own that timber at that time, or
Yeah.
did he buy that?
No, he owned that timber before 1908.
Is that?
And all of that 2-sheet. He also owned the Ryerson, what I know is the Ryerson Orchard.
Your grandfather is a very interesting man, Jim. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about him, how he got his start and what he accumulated over the years and so on.
Well, he was considered by his.
What's his name?
What's his name? Okay. I'm getting prompted from the wings.
That's all right. We can use all the help we can get.
Yeah, that's right. No, he was George Matthew Thompson, and he was born in Story County, Iowa, in 1858. And his family settled in Iowa in the 1840s. And as a matter of fact, his father, who was Franklin James, the first Franklin James, his father was one of the first settlers in that part of Iowa. So much so that he and others formed the government His wife was Sarah Elizabeth French, and the Frenches came to Iowa at the same time and settled there. And they formed the first government of Story County, and William French was the brother-in-law, and Franklin ran for all the offices in the county government, and William was elected surveyor, and Franklin was elected county clerk. He was also clerk of the district court. And Franklin was born in Virginia, and his father was George King Thompson. And George King and his two brothers left Virginia about 1826 and started out first they settled in Butler County, Ohio, and then they moved on to Randolph, Illinois, where George King promptly died of malaria and left his wife, whose name was Anstice Collison, at the age of 20, with 4 children under the age of 8. And she did the only reason.
Older than that.
Pardon?
She was a little older than that.
Maybe she was 22, I don't know. She was 16 when they were married, I know that. Anyway, she was born in 1810. That's right, she was in 1832, she would have been 22, okay. Anyway, she promptly married a man named Matthew Coverdale, and they had no more children. I guess she had decided that was enough risk in her life. And she lived to a ripe old age in that part of Illinois, and her children grew up, and Franklin moved further west, and they must have had a good relationship, because when one of Franklin's sons was born, he named him George after George King, his father, and Matthew after Matthew Coverdale, his stepfather. And anyway, Franklin was one of the brothers that moved west into Iowa. Then it was too cold in Iowa, and he moved down through Kansas and finally settled near Girard, Kansas, where he farmed until 1900, when he and his wife moved to Dayton, where George had gone further west. Now, George was one of the younger sons, and when he was 18, he taught school in Missouri for a while, and then he took the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1870s out to San Francisco, and then he came up from San Francisco to the Dalles by boat. And as he wrote in his memoirs, he landed in the Dalles with a quarter in his pocket and really no future. So he walked up the railroad tracks, because there was a portage railroad at the Dalles at that time, and got a job working for a farmer there. And he worked there for a few months, and then another fellow, and he rented a piece of ground near the Dalles and started raising vegetables. And as he wrote, that lasted about a year because he couldn't compete with the Chinese truck carters that were also established in the Columbia Valley. So he got a job with the railroad, the Oregon Rail and Navigation Company. And he worked for them until 1908 when he retired. He was 50 at the time. And as the railroad was expanded up, this depot, was down across the river. He said that when he first came up the Touchy Valley, by that time he was an engineer on the railway, he thought he had never seen such a beautiful spot. He decided he would live there. So he was a thrifty person. There are some in town of an earlier generation that would be less flattering. They call him an old skinflint. And he saved his money, and he married a lady who was equally saving, Clara Marie Berg. And they were neighbors in Kansas, and he went back to Kansas and married her and brought her out here in 1889. And he was 31, and she was 26, I think. She's an old maid by those standards, I guess. But anyway, they had 3 sons, George Raymond and Franklin James and William Christian. And they saved their money. First they lived down by the depot when it was across the river. And then when the depot moved up here, they lived in a little house that's still standing across the side street from the Carnational Church. And then later they moved up to the what we always call the brick house on 4th Street, which is one of the in the Dayton tour, they called it the Dexter House. Yes, it was built by Dexter lived in it, first built it. But they lived there for about 15 years. And my father and his brothers were raised in that house.
Jim, may I ask you a question? I've heard Dean's father and my father speak of your grandfather, but they never called him by George. Why is that? What was he known as?
Well, I only knew him as George. What did they call him?
Well, was it
Baldy. That's what his nickname was. Well, I never dared. You know, I never saw my grandfather bald because he was bald at the billiard in his early pictures, and I have pictures. But anyway, that's kind of the crux of the story. And the funny part is that he saved his money, and the railroads paid engineers very well in those days. They were paid in a comparable scale to airline pilots today. And so he and Carrie, which was my grandmother's preferred name, Cora Marie, saved their money, and they were thrifty. I could tell you stories about how thrifty they were. Anyway, they accumulated enough money that they loaned money to farmers and people around town. And in the panic, I think of 1892 and around in the 90s, they acquired a good deal of property by foreclosure. And that's why when Mike talks about Baldy Thompson, there were a number of people that weren't very enchanted with my grandfather in those days. And he never did really farm. You see, he never lived on a farm or except as a boy. Well, anyway, for whatever reason, and I've always suspected maybe that he wasn't very popular in town, in 1908, they moved to Portland, Oregon, where he expected, I think, to establish himself as a leading citizen. And he discovered that as a leading citizen in Dayton, going to Portland, he was less than leading. They lived next door to the Nesmiths, who was a senator from the state of Oregon, and the same Nesmith that married into the Ankeny family, and Nessie Ankeny, and he lived there, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a bigger puddle down there.
Yeah. Anyway, in 1912, he ran for Congress on the Bull Moose ticket. He was all his life he was enamored with Teddy Roosevelt. He was a rather ambivalent person because he was in some ways very conservative, but in many ways he was a radical, because he was one of the founding members of the Washington State Farmers Union. He was their first secretary. And I think that was an outgrowth of being a railway engineer and belonging to the Brotherhood of Railway Locomotive Engineers, whatever it was. But he was defeated in 1912, along with Teddy Roosevelt. And so he decided to move back to Dayton. Well, he left Dayton Ball's billiard ball and came back with a full head of hair, which he wore the rest of his life.
Willamette Valley Rains.
It was, it's wonderful. And he was very vain because during the Depression, when money was very scarce, I went with Granddad and my father to Spokane, where he bought a new toupee. And those toupees cost a couple $100 in those days. You know, that was, at least when in my scale of values, that was a fortune. And it was too. Well, he first lived up in the house that Charlie Broughton Jr. lived in on Syndicate Hill. And that was too windy. He told me once that the day the screen door flew open and blew all the milk bottles off the back porch was the day he decided to move. So then he, in 1914, built the house down here on Pettit Avenue and lived there really almost the rest of his life. In that period after 1914, he shared an office with C.J. Broughton Sr. and bought and sold grain. And
Where was that office, Jim?
I don't really know where it was, because by the time I was born in 1924, that was past. C.J. Broughton died in 1920.
I wondered if it was the office of Broughton Land Company now.
I don't know. It could have been, but who knows? And I suspect that when I say he shared an office, he probably had a desk in the office, because his grain operation was relatively small compared with C.J. Broughton's. I don't know whether it's true or not. You'd have to check with Chad, but my grandfather told me once that C.J. Broughton Sr. in the period of World War I was clearing more than $200,000 a year tax-free out of his grain trade, which is probably one reason the bank got started. Well, anyway, he had the misfortune to misjudge the speculation in grain. And in 1920, when everybody expected grain to go sky high, it was $2 a bushel. Everybody thought it was going to go to $3, and overnight it went to $1. And he ended up with all of his capital gone and a mortgage on everything he owned. And as you know, the 1920s were not kind to farm operators any more than today. And by 1932, faced with the Depression and all of that, the various banks were going to foreclose on him. And he was saved only by the Federal Land Bank, which was established in 1933, I think, or around in there. But since he was in his 70s by then, they would not finance him. So he had to transfer his properties to his sons for $1 in the debts. And he transferred the Touchy Ranch, the farmland, to Ray, and the Catawba to my father, and the mountain property to Bill. And then my dad managed all of it. And that's when he traded in the old 75 and bought a D6 Caterpillar. And he was able to transport that back and forth from the Tushy to the Pataw on the truck bed. And then they had combines on each side. And his crew moved back and forth from the harvest was always earlier on the Pataw, and they started at the Pataw, and he had a crew with a cook, and then they'd move out to the North Tushy and then up on Cato Mountain. And the harvest was almost, it was the whole summer in those days.
And they probably start out on the Tahoe around the 1st of July.
Mm-hmm.
Be going until September up on the mountain.
Yeah, they did. And so that's really it. He farmed until 1942. And in 1941, he always had a hard time with his brothers and his father. His father lived down the block and was second guessing everything that he did. And his brothers, who Ray had a business in Walla Walla, and Will was a dentist in Oregon, and they were always giving him advice. So in 1942 on the Pataw, he had an excellent crop for those days. The wheat was taller than I am. I'm 6'2", or was. And I could go out and you couldn't see me. It was those old varieties, you know, where there was a lot of straw. And anyway, he cleared the mortgage on the Pataw and told his brothers that they could seek their own destiny. And leased the Pataw ranch to Oscar Scherer, who farmed it then until, I can't remember which year it was, but anyway, Oscar Scherer's niece and her husband, Ellis Cox, Maxine McFarland, I think her name was. And Ellis Cox farmed it then until Ellis Cox's son Bob has the lease now. And they farmed it, the Scherer-Cox combination has farmed that place longer than my father ever did.
Is that right?
Well, he farmed from 1916 until 1942. And they farmed it from 1942 to 50 years almost. Yeah. But that's how they got into the Holt 75 tractor business.
Right.
Now, Dad was probably the first modern farmer, I think, in this area. He moved to the mechanical equipment. He innovated in grain storage. He stored bulk grain. He sold his grain independently down on the, when there was a railroad going up the Tahoe Valley. He had a grain cleaning building where he trucked the grain from the bins, or eventually the elevator up on the ranch, down to Chard, and he'd clean it and load
He loaded his own cars.
And he got a premium for the cleaning grain. There were times during the Depression when he made the mortgage payments by, combines weren't as efficient then as they are now. And he'd buy 1,000 little piglets, and castrate them, which was the least pleasant part of the job, and turn them loose on the stubble. And they'd gain a couple of pounds,